ago, a political firestorm erupted live on television. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor who claims to be steering Britain's economy, faced Nigel Farage head-on and it ended in disaster. What was meant to be a confident defence of her record turned into a full-blown meltdown. Farage exposed her career claims, her financial missteps and her shaky grip on the economy in front of millions watching. The tension was electric. The cracks in Reeves' story, already questioned for weeks, split wide open on air, leaving her credibility hanging by a thread. This wasn't just another political clash, this was the moment where a sitting Chancellor was stripped bare of her own narrative, with the public left asking one simple question. If Rachel Reeves can't tell the truth about her past, how can she possibly be trusted with Britain's future? Nigel Farage wasted no time. From the very first question, he tore into Reeves's claim that she had spent a decade working at the Bank of England. For years, she has repeated that line, presenting herself as a seasoned economist with 10 years of central banking experience. But on live TV, Farage produced the facts. She was only there for 5.5 years, not 10. And worse, the role she held wasn't as an economist shaping policy, but in customer service, a far cry from the authoritative financial expert she had painted herself to be. The revelation landed like a thunderclap. Reeves shifted in her seat, her voice faltered, and the audience could sense the pressure building. Farage didn't just expose an exaggeration, he exposed a pattern and a habit of bending the truth to appear more credible than she really was. And once that mask slipped, the floodgates opened. He moved next to her history with expenses, reminding viewers of the time she lost her parliamentary credit card after racking up more than £4,000 in unpaid bills. Farage's words cut sharply. How could someone trusted with running the economy not even manage a single credit card responsibly? The point was impossible to ignore. Reeves stuttered out a defence, insisting that people should judge her on the job she was doing today, not on mistakes from the past. But Farage pressed harder. He reminded her and the country that trust is not built on excuses, it is built on honesty, and once lost, it is nearly impossible to recover. Reeves's attempt to pivot back to talking points about growing the economy and improving living standards sounded hollow in the face of her own contradictions. The studio grew tense as Farage continued. He mocked her celebration of a 0.1% growth rate as though it were a triumph, calling it stagnation with a shiny label. His words resonated because they echoed the frustration of ordinary people who see their bills rising, wages stagnating, and businesses struggling, while politicians boast about meaningless numbers. The more Reeves tried to insist that things were improving, the more her words rang false. Farage framed her as the embodiment of a political class out of touch with reality, clinging to weak statistics while ordinary Britons feel the squeeze of every shopping trip, every energy bill, every tax rise. The audience knew it, Farage knew it, and by the end of the first exchange, Reeves herself seemed to know it too. But Farage wasn't finished. He pushed on, drawing attention to the bigger issue. If Reeves exaggerated about her past, if she struggled with her own finances, if she boasted about pitiful growth figures, what else is she misleading the public about? The implication was chilling. Could it be that the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the person in charge of Britain's finances, was not only incompetent but fundamentally untrustworthy? Each question Farage asked tightened the noose around Reeves's credibility, and each answer she gave only seemed to dig her deeper into the hole. This was no ordinary political clash. This was a systematic dismantling of a reputation, and it was unfolding in real time. And as the clash went on, viewers at home weren't just witnessing a heated debate, they were witnessing a turning point. Nigel Farage had tapped into something raw. Public anger, public distrust, public exhaustion with politicians who bend the truth and then expect forgiveness. Reeves tried to stand firm, but every defence sounded weaker, every justification thinner. By the end of the first segment, she wasn't just on the defensive. She was visibly shaken, her authority undermined, her reputation hanging in the balance. What was meant to be a confident appearance had spiralled into a live meltdown, and Nigel Farage was holding the match that lit the fire. As the cameras kept rolling, Rachel Reeves struggled to regain control of the conversation. Her words came faster, her tone sharper, as if speed could mask the weakness of her arguments. But Nigel Farage wasn't letting go. He pressed harder, pointing out that credibility is the foundation of political leadership. If you can't even be honest about where you worked and for how long, he said, why should anyone believe you when you talk about the economy? The line hit like a hammer. Reeves tried to dismiss it as a slip of the tongue, a minor detail blown out of proportion, but Farage seized the moment. A decade is not the same as 5 years, he fired back, and calling yourself an economist when you are handling customer service isn't just a mistake, it's a lie. The silence that followed was telling. Viewers could sense Reeves losing ground, not only in her words, but in her composure. She leaned on her prepared lines about investment, growth and opportunity, but they sounded robotic, almost rehearsed. Farage, on the other hand, thrived in the chaos. His tone was sharp, his delivery relentless, and his confidence unshakable. Every time Reeves tried to steer the conversation back to Labour's promises, he dragged her straight back into her past. Her CV, her credit card scandal, her misleading claims. The contrast was stark. One side defensive, the other aggressive, and the audience could feel who was winning. Then came the pivot to Britain's so-called growth. Reeves tried again to paint a picture of progress, pointing to the much-repeated 0.1% GDP increase. She smiled faintly as she called it proof that the economy is on the right path. But Farage was ready. He laughed. A short, sharp laugh that cut through her words, and replied, if 0.1% is the best you've got, then Britain isn't growing, it's crawling. The line stuck. Viewers at home didn't need charts or statistics to understand what he meant. They were living it. Their bills were higher, their paychecks smaller, and their savings evaporating. Reeves's optimism sounded less like leadership and more like denial. Farage didn't stop there. He reminded the audience that while ordinary families were struggling, MPs, including Reeves, were receiving pay raises. The outrage was palpable. How, he demanded, can politicians justify lining their own pockets while the public can't afford to heat their homes? Reeves tried to argue that pay rises were decided independently, not by ministers themselves. But the damage was done. The optics were terrible. The image of politicians rewarding themselves while citizens tightened their belts was a powerful one, and Farage knew it. He hammered the point relentlessly, tying it directly to Reeves's credibility crisis. It's always the same story, he thundered. One rule for them, another for us. By this point, Reeves was visibly uncomfortable. She crossed her arms, shifted in her chair, and raised her voice as though volume alone could restore authority. But Farage anticipated every move. When she claimed that the UK had avoided recession, he cut in with the brutal truth. GDP per head is falling. People are poorer now than they were last year. That, Chancellor, is a recession by any other name. Reeves shook her head, muttering that the numbers were preliminary, subject to revision, but it sounded weak. For the audience, the numbers weren't abstract. They were reality. Their standard of living had fallen, and Reeves' excuses felt like spin. What made the clash so compelling was not just Farage's attacks, but Reeves' failure to counter them. Time and again she tried to pivot, only to be dragged back into the same uncomfortable truths. She had exaggerated her experience. She had mishandled her expenses. She was celebrating economic stagnation as if it were success. And she was part of a political class that seemed more interested in protecting itself than serving the people. Each point alone was damaging. Together, they painted a devastating picture of incompetence and dishonesty. The tension built with every exchange. Reeves's voice cracked as she tried to defend her record, and the more she insisted that she was qualified to do the job, the more it sounded like she was trying to convince herself rather than the public. Farage leaned in, his tone calm but cutting, and asked the question that lingered long after the debate ended. If you can't be straight with us about your own career, why should we trust you with ours? The words hung in the air, impossible to ignore. Reeves blinked, searching for an answer, but none came. By the end of the second section of their exchange, the meltdown was undeniable. Reeves had started the night hoping to project strength and competence. Instead, she looked cornered, defensive and exposed. Farage had not only dismantled her arguments, but also left viewers with the chilling sense that the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the person holding Britain's financial future in her hands, might not be up to the task. And in politics, once doubt takes hold, it spreads fast. The longer the confrontation went on, the more it became clear that Rachel Reeves was running out of room to manoeuvre. Each attempt to defend herself only opened another line of attack. Nigel Farage had come prepared, not with vague accusations, but with precise facts and pointed questions that pierced straight through her carefully rehearsed answers. The tension in the studio was so sharp it could almost be felt through the screen. Viewers at home were not just watching a political interview, they were watching a demolition in progress. Farage's next strike was brutal but effective. He reminded the audience of the promise Reeves had made before taking office, a promise that she would not raise the big three taxes, income tax, VAT or national insurance. She had boasted that she could fund Britain's needs without touching these core revenue streams. Yet here she was, defending tax increases on businesses and employment, policies that directly hit workers and small companies struggling to survive. Farage seized on the contradiction with glee. "You tied your own hands," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "You made a promise you couldn't keep. And instead of admitting it, you're punishing the people who can least afford it." Reeves tried to insist that her decisions were in the national interest, that tough choices had to be made. But her words rang hollow. Farage cut in again. "Tough choices? For who? Because it doesn't seem very tough for the politicians who keep giving themselves pay rises, does it? It's only tough for the people paying your bills." The audience at home didn't need statistics to understand this point. They were living it every day. The anger was raw, and Farage was channeling it with ruthless precision. Then came the reminder of her expenses scandal, a wound that refused to heal. Farage described how Reeves had her parliamentary credit card revoked after failing to clear more than £4,000 in spending. "You lost the right to use a single card," he snapped. "And now you expect us to believe you can manage the finances of the entire nation?" Reeves flushed, her face tight with frustration, but she could not escape the truth of the record. She tried to argue that she had moved past it, that mistakes from nearly a decade ago shouldn't define her. But Farage pounced. "It's not about when it happened. It's about what it shows. Recklessness, carelessness, and a refusal to take responsibility." The clash moved beyond economics into the territory of character, and that was where Reeves faltered most. Because credibility is not just about policy, it's about trust, consistency, and integrity. Every time she tried to redirect the discussion toward Labour's vision for the future, Farage dragged it back to the same central theme. Can the public trust Rachel Reeves? And with each passing moment, the answer seemed less certain. Her body language betrayed her. Arms folded tightly across her chest, eyes darting, her tone defensive. Meanwhile, Farage appeared relaxed, leaning forward with the confidence of a man who knew he had the upper hand. He even found moments to inject sarcasm, ridiculing Reeves's boast that Britain had narrowly avoided recession. "Avoided it?" he sneered. "You've steered us into a situation where living standards are falling, income per head is collapsing, and you're cheering because the headline number just about avoids the word recession. That's like sinking a ship and celebrating because at least part of the deck is still above water." The audience laughed nervously, but the point landed with devastating effect. Reeves attempted to counter by citing her academic credentials, a master's degree in economics from the London School of Economics, years of study, and her so-called experience at the Bank of England. But Farage was ready for that too. "You studied economics, yes, but studying a subject and running a nation are not the same thing. And as for your decade at the Bank of England, well, we've already established that was half the time you claimed, and not the role you pretended. So forgive me, Chancellor, if I don't take your word for it." Reeves tried to interject, but her voice was drowned out by the weight of her own exposed contradictions. By now, the meltdown was complete. Reeves was no longer steering the conversation. She was reacting, scrambling, clinging to fragments of her prepared lines. Farage, by contrast, had full control of the narrative. Every new point reinforced his central argument. Rachel Reeves was not the honest, competent leader she claimed to be, but a politician caught in her own web of exaggerations and weak defences. The damage was deepening by the second, and then Farage raised the stakes even higher. He warned that this was not just about one Chancellor's credibility, it was about the credibility of the government itself. "If the person running our economy can't be trusted with her own words," he declared, "then how can Labour expect the people to trust them with the country?" The implication was explosive. Reeves's meltdown was no longer just her personal crisis. It threatened to become a political crisis for her entire party. As the segment drew on, the sense of suspense only grew. Would Reeves fight back with a strong counterattack, or would she continue to crumble under the pressure? Each attempt she made to recover seemed weaker than the last, and the audience, both in the studio and at home, knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. A sitting chancellor being dismantled in real time, exposed not only for her policies, but for the cracks in her integrity. For Labour, the warning lights were flashing red. For Reeves, the nightmare was only just beginning. By the time the debate entered its next phase, the damage to Rachel Reeves' image was undeniable. What began as a tense exchange had spiralled into something far more devastating. A complete collapse of authority, played out in front of a live audience. Reeves had hoped to project the image of a calm, competent chancellor, steering Britain through difficult economic waters. Instead, she appeared cornered, defensive, and increasingly desperate. Farage sensed blood in the water, and he wasn't about to let the moment pass. He leaned back in his chair, allowing just a second of silence to stretch before striking again. The pause was deliberate, giving viewers time to absorb just how much Reeves was floundering. Then, with a tone of sharp precision, he raised a question that cut to the heart of the matter. If you are prepared to exaggerate your past to make yourself look stronger, what else are you exaggerating? What other numbers, what other promises, what other stories are being dressed up for the public? The question was not only rhetorical, but devastating in its simplicity. It cast doubt not just on Reeves's career history, but on every single word she had spoken since taking office. Reeves' response was shaky. She insisted that she had always acted with integrity, that her career in economics and politics showed her commitment to public service. But the more she insisted, the weaker she sounded. It was as if she didn't believe her own words anymore. The audience could see it, and so could Farage. He cut across at her mid-sentence, striking with another brutal point. Integrity isn't about what you say, it's about what you do. And when your credit card is taken away, when your CV doesn't match reality, when your promises turn to dust, that's not integrity, that's deception. The studio grew heavy with tension. Reeves's eyes flickered, her jaw tightened, and she tried to change the subject back to economic growth and Labour's future plans. But Farage didn't let go. He pulled her back again, this time to the human cost of her policies. Tell the millions of families struggling to pay their bills that 0.1% growth is something to celebrate. Tell the small businesses being strangled by higher taxes that this is success. Tell the workers who've seen their paychecks shrink in real terms that they should be thankful. Do you really think they believe you? His words echoed what so many viewers were already thinking. Reeves had no convincing reply. And then came the turning point. Farage stopped attacking her directly for a moment and instead turned to the bigger picture. This is why people don't trust politicians anymore, he said, his voice steady and deliberate. They hear one story during campaigns, another story when the numbers come out, and then excuse after excuse when the truth doesn't add up. It's not just about Rachel Reeves, it's about an entire system that rewards failure and punishes honesty. And the public is sick of it. This broader attack was lethal. It transformed Reeves's meltdown from a personal crisis into a symbol of something larger, the decay of political trust across the board. Reeves tried to interrupt, claiming that she was focused on delivering results and that people would see the difference as her policies took effect. But her voice shook, and the words sounded like the empty promises voters had heard for decades. Farage seized on the weakness where we've heard it all before, he snapped. Every politician promises results tomorrow, but people don't live tomorrow, they live today, and today, under your leadership, they are worse off. The line landed like a hammer, drawing murmurs from the audience. Reeves lowered her eyes, clearly rattled. What made the moment even more damning was that Reeves had no powerful counterattack. She couldn't go after Farage with the same force, because every time she tried to pivot to Labour's plans, she was dragged back into her own contradictions. She couldn't land a punch without leaving herself open to another devastating counterblow. It was the political equivalent of being trapped in a corner, swinging wildly while your opponent delivers precise, calculated strikes. And Farage wasn't finished. He reminded viewers of something Reeves had hoped to bury, her trip to Davos. You fly off to Davos to rub shoulders with the elites, he said, while ordinary people back home can't afford their groceries. And then you come back and tell us Britain is on the up because of a fraction of a percent in GDP growth. Who are you trying to kid? Because the people aren't buying it. Reeves attempted to argue that international cooperation was important for Britain's economy, but by then her words were drowned out by the sheer weight of public anger Farage had tapped into. The meltdown was now complete. Reeves's credibility wasn't just dented, it was shattered. And what made it worse was that she had done little to defend herself effectively. Instead of confronting Farage's points head on, she had tried to dodge, deflect and reframe. But each time the evasion only made her look weaker. Every defensive answer was another admission of vulnerability. Every attempt at optimism sounded like denial. By the end of this section of the debate, viewers weren't asking whether Rachel Reeves had stumbled. They were asking whether she could survive as Chancellor at all. And as Farage's words echoed in the studio, one truth became clear. This wasn't just about a single clash on live television, it was about a deeper reckoning with the kind of leadership Britain wanted. Reeves had been exposed, stripped of the image she had carefully built, and replaced with the reality of someone who bent the truth, mishandled money, and spun weak numbers into hollow victories. Farage had not only destroyed her in the moment, he had planted seeds of doubt that would linger far beyond the broadcast. For Reeves, the storm had only just begun. As the debate dragged on, it became clear that Rachel Reeves was no longer defending her policies. She was fighting for her political survival. Each passing minute deepened the impression that the Chancellor had lost control, not just of the discussion, but of the very narrative surrounding her leadership. Nigel Farage had methodically stripped away every layer of her public persona until only raw, uncomfortable truth remained. Viewers weren't just witnessing a political clash, they were watching a career unravel in real time. Farage pressed harder, hammering on the contradictions that Reeves could not escape. So you say Britain is turning a corner, he scoffed, but look around. Families can't pay rent, energy bills are soaring, small businesses are collapsing, and taxes are higher than they've ever been. What corner are we turning? The corner into more misery. His words carried the fury of millions of ordinary Britons who felt betrayed and abandoned by the very government meant to protect them. Reeves, visibly shaken, muttered about long-term stability, but her voice wavered. Stability in that moment was the last thing she conveyed. The humiliation deepened when Farage revisited her much-hyped credentials. You parade around your so-called decade at the Bank of England, he said sharply. But the truth is you weren't even there half that time. You weren't running policy. You weren't making decisions. You were a junior analyst. Yet you spin it as if you held the reins of the nation's economy. That's not experience, Chancellor. That's fiction. The studio fell silent. Reeves's face tightened, her lips pursed as she tried to hold her composure, but it was clear to everyone watching she had been exposed. And then with perfect timing, Farage tied the threads together. This isn't just about a dodgy CV, it's about honesty. It's about whether the people of this country can trust the words of those who claim to lead them. You've exaggerated your record, you've failed with your numbers, and you've punished the very people you promised to help. That's not leadership. That's betrayal. The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Betrayal. In that moment, Reeves's meltdown was complete. She wasn't just losing a debate, she was losing the trust of the nation. Reeves attempted one last counterattack, insisting that Labour was the only party with a real plan to fix Britain's broken economy. But her words no longer carried weight. The authority was gone. Every syllable sounded rehearsed, disconnected, hollow. Farage leaned in, delivering his final blow with the calm confidence of a man who knew he had already won. Plans mean nothing when they come from people. The public doesn't believe. And tonight, Chancellor, the people can see you for what you are. They don't believe you. The effect was devastating. Social media lit up instantly with clips of the clash spreading like wildfire. Hashtags mocking Reeves trended within minutes. Commentators spoke of a career-defining humiliation. Even some within her own party whispered that she had become a liability. The meltdown wasn't confined to the studio. It was spilling into every corner of the political landscape. The story wasn't just that Nigel Farage had destroyed Rachel Reeves on live TV, it was that her credibility, already fragile, had collapsed under scrutiny and the cracks could no longer be hidden. For Reeves, the fallout was immediate. Headlines framed the night as a disaster, while opposition voices called for her resignation. The scandal over her expenses resurfaced, the false claims about her Bank of England tenure returned to the spotlight, and the narrative of betrayal hardened into a single, unavoidable truth. Rachel Reeves could no longer control the story about herself. Farage had not only exposed her weaknesses, he had redefined her in the eyes of the public. But beyond the personal humiliation, the clash revealed something deeper about Britain's political climate. It showed just how fragile trust had become, how quickly a leader's image could crumble under the weight of their own contradictions. Reeves's collapse was not just a warning to her, but to every politician who thought they could spin, exaggerate and mislead their way to power. The people were watching more closely than ever, and they were ready to punish dishonesty with brutal swiftness. The suspense of the night gave way to a new kind of tension. What would happen next? Would Labour rally around Reeves, or would she be pushed aside as the weak link in an already strained chain? Would Farage's devastating performance propel him further into the national spotlight, cementing his role as the most dangerous critic of the establishment? And most importantly, what would the people think now that they had seen the Chancellor dismantled so publicly? As the cameras cut away and the debate ended, one truth was unavoidable. Rachel Reeves had entered the studio as Chancellor of the Exchequer, hoping to prove herself as a steady hand on the economy. She left it humiliated, her credibility in ruins, her future uncertain. Nigel Farage had not just debated her, he had destroyed her, and Britain, watching in shock, knew that nothing would be the same again. The meltdown was complete, the exposure was total, and the fallout had only just begun.